Good morning and thanks everyone for joining us. It takes Zoom a good minute and a half to add everybody, so just sit tight and we'll get started in a few moments. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Just going to give it another 30 seconds or so to let Zoom allow everyone into the room, and then we'll get started. So just sit tight and thanks very much. Okay, I think we will go ahead and get started. Hopefully everyone is in the room now. Thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to the latest Duke media briefing on the COVID-19 pandemic and its effects on society. I'm Gregory Phillips with Duke Communications and I'm moderating this event. Millions of teachers and students across the country are about to begin a new school year remotely. School systems are better prepared than they were in the spring, but online education at this scale means bridging several divides, from the physical distance between teachers and students to the access to technology to make online learning possible. We have 3 Duke scholars with us today to discuss these challenges and how students, teachers and parents can adjust to starting the school year remotely. I'll introduce our speakers and get the discussion started, then we'll open it up to questions. We are recording this briefing and that recording will be sent to everyone who registered. Thanks to those reporters who already sent questions. During this discussion, those of you joining us on Zoom can submit questions via the Q&A window at any time. There will also be an opportunity to ask questions in person in a few minutes. Thanks also to everyone watching this on YouTube. With us today, we have Leslie Babinski. She is the Director of the Center for Child and Family Policy and an Associate Research Professor in the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke. She is a licensed psychologist who studies children and adolescents and professional development for teachers. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Also joining us is Brian Cooper. He is Director of Educational Innovation and Online Learning at Duke's Talent Identification Program. He taught in Durham Public Schools for 6 years and at Duke has created new distance learning program models and online educational programming. Good morning to you, Brian.
Good morning, Greg.
And we have Kenneth Dodge. He is a professor of public policy at the Sanford School of Public Policy and a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Duke, where he studies early childhood development. Dodge is the founding and past director of the Center for Child and Family Policy. Good morning to you.
Good morning, everyone.
So Brian, we'll start with you. Remote learning brings challenges that have little to do with the curriculum itself. Can you tell us about some of the challenges for teachers, students, and parents?
Sure. Remote learning really requires students, teachers, and parents to a lesser degree to learn a whole new set of skills. So at the beginning of the school year, obviously there are transitions. They're learning a new teacher. They're learning new classroom rules, new school rules perhaps, but they're still playing the same game essentially. And remote learning really is like playing a different game. Students, teachers, parents, they have to figure out how to do all these familiar things, but in a new and different way. So how do I submit assignments? How do I deliver instruction? How do I ask a question? Some of those simple fundamental things that students and teachers are accustomed to doing as second nature. And so it's almost like resetting students. In some ways, it's an imperfect analogy, but almost like students going back to kindergarten where they're learning how to do school. And in some ways, it's almost like teachers becoming first-year teachers again, learning how to do all of these things for the first time. And so I think there are a variety of ways that those stakeholders can address those issues. I think one of the first things is to plan for it, plan for this new reality, plan for extra time that it's going to take to learn to do these new things in these new ways. Don't expect it to be regular school because it won't be. I think it's also important to intentionally build in time to practice with these new tools and technologies. So what that means is at the beginning of the school year, instead of jumping right into some of the content, You may very well need to spend 2 or 3 days, maybe even a week, just having students practicing how to submit an assignment, how to ask a question, how to send an email, how to use all the tools that they're going to be doing. So planning and practice, I think also for the instructors, for the teachers and administrators, paring down the number of tools that they're using is going to make it much easier for students. Every time you introduce a new tool, you're introducing a new learning curve that takes mental and emotional energy. And so paring down those tools, being more selective, I think is really helpful. Creating patterns and routines for students so they know what to expect and when, I think is really, really valuable, particularly now when there's so few areas of regularity in all of our lives. So helping students, parents, and teachers know what to do, teachers helping parents establish those patterns and schedules, I think can be really valuable. And last, but certainly not least, I think being patient. I think it's really important to assume positive intentions, to recognize that parents and teachers are on the same page. They're sharing the same goal of trying to provide the best education they can during these trying circumstances. And so having a generosity of spirit to be patient with each other as we're all learning together.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Certainly a lot to dig into there. But right now we are going to move on to you. Ken, when we discuss educating children online during the pandemic, there's this unspoken assumption that all families have the necessary devices and internet connection and everything else to access that online learning. But can you give us a sense of the scale of the inequity that actually exists in the real world?
Yes, Greg, thank you. My colleague, Ubai, and I recently analyzed responses from the American Community Survey. There are about 51 million children in K-12 schools in America. To our amazement, that assumption about having the technology at home simply does not hold. About 8.6 million children, K-12 age, do not have the necessary equipment at home to participate in remote learning. That's about 1 in 6 children in America. That is, they either do not have internet service coming to their home, or they do not have an internet subscription that supports high-speed access, or they don't have a computer device in their home, let alone whether they have the knowledge and the parent to supervise them. Furthermore, there are great disparities, as you would expect. Almost 1 in 3 low-income students in America will not be able to participate adequately in remote education unless we do something, because they don't have access. That's compared to only about 7.5% of middle-income students. So about 4 times as many low-income students are going to be shut out of remote education. What that will do is to increase the disparities in educational outcomes that are already present, and they will simply grow over time unless we do something.
Absolutely, thank you. And we'll certainly dig into some possible solutions to that inequity as we get into this. But now, Professor Babinski, I'd like to move on to you. You've worked with kindergartners, first graders, and English as a second language teachers over the past year as part of your ongoing research into supporting English learners. What are some of the things you've learned from teachers during this pivot to online schooling, both for students who are learning English, but also for remote teaching for all young children?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this important discussion today. I'd like to start by providing a little bit of context around what I'm going to share about that ongoing study that you just mentioned. So this past spring, we were in the middle of working with kindergarten, first grade, and ESL, or English as a second language teachers in 17 elementary schools across North Carolina, when teachers had to pivot to online instruction. So even though we weren't able to finish the research study that it provided us with an opportunity for a really up close look at what was happening during the pivot to remote teaching. Our research focuses on teacher collaboration, high impact instructional strategies for language and literacy, and leveraging families' cultural wealth in the classroom. We continue to work with our teachers during their pivot to remote teaching. And through this process, we learned so much about the successes, the challenges, and also the opportunities for online learning. I think it's really important that we listen to teachers and their experiences during this period in planning for the next school year. So I'd like to share a little bit about what we've learned from the teachers. We surveyed the 63 teachers across 17 elementary schools that I mentioned. 44 of these teachers were classroom teachers, and 19 of them were the ESL teachers who also worked with the same students. We also asked teachers to report on the engagement of their English learners during remote teaching. And so we heard back from 81 of the English learners that we were following as part of this larger study. So for a bit more context, the teachers that we were working with provided online instruction in a variety of formats. They did pre-recorded lessons. They provided some live lessons. They did small group instructions live. And they also reached out to children and their families in a variety of ways through phone calls and text messages and all sorts of things. So I want to just highlight a couple of the important things just to get started. First of all, as Ken mentioned, we recognized and teachers reported that there were serious inequities in access to online schooling. In our study, teachers reported that 65% of the English learner students required that the school provide a device for access to online schooling. In addition, 31% of the students needed a hotspot to be able to access the internet. So as you can imagine, even with now a device and access to the internet, these young children and their parents really struggled to access the school login information, not to mention all the different various learning platforms that the teachers were using. So we learned from the teachers that online learning really does require a partnership between teachers and parents or their other caregivers. Teachers in our study reported that the English learners, that almost half of the English learners, 48%, did not have a parent available during the day to help with online learning. Many of the parents of the students in our study continue to work outside the home during the pandemic. We also learned about the steep learning curve that teachers were on to adapt to this new way of teaching. Teachers were amazingly innovative and creative in adapting various learning platforms to make sure that they were able to engage their young students. We heard about teachers using things such as, well, in addition to Google Classroom and Google Meet, certainly Class Dojo, Talking Points, Pear Deck. Teachers were using learning platforms that allowed for two-way translation to be able to communicate back and forth with their students' parents. So I'm happy to talk more about these highlights as well as some of our other findings on teacher collaboration and the stresses that teachers were under time and how we look forward to online learning for the start of the school year. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you to all of our panelists for those comprehensive openings. We've certainly got a lot to dig into here. And Ken, I'd like to come back to you first because all three of you have talked about this issue of access, and you've got a 4-point plan, right, for addressing unequal access to technology. What remedies do you recommend so that every child can participate in remote education to begin with?
Yes, thank you. We think there are 4 steps that are necessary for each child to participate. First, the household needs to have broadband internet access coming to their home. It should be like other utilities, electricity, water. It's long been needed, but unfortunately, particularly in rural areas, too many children don't even have that opportunity. That would help businesses. It would help families in other ways. It seems like a broad, general, long overdue solution to provide that fiber optic nerve centers to get broadband access to every home. Second, each child's family will need a subscription to high-speed internet access with enough data to support the remote learning. Perhaps at about $50 a month or $600 a year, 6.5 million children will need this. They do not have this at the moment. That's roughly $4 billion for the entire nation. A lot of money, no doubt, but not a lot of money compared to the $1 trillion economic stimulus package that is being contemplated. Third, each child will need a computer device, a tablet, a desktop, a laptop, some kind of device to be able to log on. And perhaps at $300 a device, 5 million children will need this. That's $1.5 billion. And finally, assuming there is broadband access and they have a subscription and they have a device, we need to have training for parents and children in how to access the internet, how to use it, training and support for parents to supervise their children at whatever cost that can be. Schools are doing a good job of this, but we'll need more.
Excellent, thank you. I'd like to remind all the reporters joining us that you can pose questions in the Q&A window, or you can raise your hand in Zoom and we can unmute you so you can ask a question in person. If you're joining by phone, you can hit *9 and that will also raise your hand so that we can unmute you. But we'll move on here. And Brian, I'd like to come back to you. You know, we've discussed here the inequities as it pertains to access, but of course the inequities at home don't end with access to technology. What are some other at-home resources that are essential to success, and how can we support children who maybe don't have an adult presence at home to offer them?
Sure. Well, I think both Ken and Leslie pointed to this a little bit, that in addition to all the great things that Ken just mentioned, we do know that there are students, particularly from low-income backgrounds, their parents are more likely to be at work outside the home. They may be less familiar with technology themselves. And so we have found, particularly with those younger students, the elementary age, we at TIP have a program for 4th, 5th, and 6th graders that's run entirely online. And we have found that for students to be successful in that program, it really does require that adult presence. And so I think some of the things that Ken was talking about with the training and resources for parents is really indispensable. And those are some things that we have implemented, things like parent open houses and opportunities for parents to tour and work with the technology. But another thing that we have found very successful at TIP is having kind of dedicated resource, you know, you might call it a success specialist, a learning coach, a dedicated resource that those students and parents can go to, who is particularly familiar with their needs and is equipped to be very responsive to their inquiries. We've found that using that model of a dedicated professional who is a go-to point of contact for those students and their parents has been very successful in driving more engagement among that population. And we have a grant-funded program we've been working on through the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation called Project Launch, that's focused on low-income students in 5th and 6th grades. And that dedicated person who can provide that scaffolded support and some of that additional training, both proactively and then responding very quickly to issues that may be unique to those learners, has been very successful.
Gotcha, thank you. And Leslie, that brings me back to you because I know that your work has also been focused on what kind of support parents of young children need to facilitate online learning. And what are some of the things that you think parents of particularly young children should be focusing on, or what are the things that they should be doing to best support their children as they learn online? And where are the gaps, do you think?
Yeah, well, there are a tremendous number of gaps, really, when you think about kindergarten, first grade students trying to access online education. It's, you know, parents are overwhelmed as, you know, trying to do anything else where you're trying to support your kindergarten or your first grader with online learning. You know, I think that we also have to remember that many teachers are parents too. And the teachers in our study told us that 39% of the classroom teachers were also caring for their own young children or another family member during online teaching, as well as 47% of the ESL teachers. And so teachers are very well aware of the multiple demands placed on parents. This is really an unprecedented time when we're asking parents to step up and serve as essentially facilitators or teachers for their children's education. It really highlights the importance of public education in keeping our economy running. So any of you who are parents certainly understand that Now the thought of having elementary school age children home, even if you are able to work from home during the day, is a tremendous challenge. I think school districts, from what I could tell, are doing a great job in preparing for the new school year in terms of setting up a consistent structure and framework for providing online education. We really have learned a lot from the experience in the spring, and I think this fall is going to be quite different. They are preparing parents to be able to access the learning platforms that are available at the school, providing training for teachers and parents alike on those applications so that it's familiar and it's something that they're able to accomplish. I think there are still big hurdles ahead. You know, if you think about how is this going to work for especially the young elementary school students and their parents, some of whom are working outside the home, some of whom are working at home, but need to concentrate on their own work. So we really have a lot of hurdles ahead, but I think teachers and schools are anticipating many of these issues and doing what they can to support families during this time.
Thank you very much. Ken, I would like to come back to you because, you know, as you describe the scale of the problem and then the potential solutions, we know that even as you mentioned, you know, the solutions are just a very small fraction of money that's being spent elsewhere. And yet we also know that perhaps in the current climate, we can't necessarily expect the kind of funding we need. Could you tell us like what some of the long-term risks are, even though it might seem obvious, to these children and to society when so many children will miss out on education because they can't be in school?
Yeah, the risks are great in at least a couple of respects. First, from research on what happens every year over the summertime, we know that children lose maybe up to 1/3 of what they had learned in the previous school year over the summertime, unless during that summer they have continual educational experiences, right? So children who are missing out, even for several months only of education, will lose some of what they had gained before. Second, we know that there are big differences, disparities in what is lost. Middle income parents, by and large, figure out or have the financial resources to make up for that lost educational experience, whereas low income children do not have that luxury. So the disparities in learning will grow. So the long-term implications, I think, are potentially permanent loss in ultimate educational outcomes for all children. And second, growing disparities in those outcomes for low-income children.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Quick logistical point, excuse me, Leslie, I wanted to come back to you. We had somebody, I guess your internet was blipping out, and just wanted to ask if you could just repeat the information about the platforms that allow two-way translation.
Sure. And what we heard from they were using something called talking points for communicating with the families of their learners, as well as Class Dojo, which the teachers tell me does two-way translation. So those were the two that teachers told us about. And just to follow up on Ken's point about, you know, what are the potential long-term implications for this learning loss during COVID? I think we need to consider that and think really seriously about what are our options for supporting students as they return to in-person schooling, hopefully in the near future. Certainly, students are missing out on the development of some academic skills. So they're missing chunks of their education in terms of specific skill development. But I guess I would like to just remember that students and children are learning all the time, that they're engaged in their homes, they're engaged in outdoor exploration, that they're continuing to grow and develop. And so what we're really missing are the actual academic skills rather than an absence of normal growth and development. And so I think schools really can address this challenge. I think we can provide for those skill sets that students have missed. It's really going to take a thoughtful application of the various interventions that we know work for figuring out where students are academically, providing intensive instruction to help them catch up or fill in the gap in their academic skill set, and then providing them with the enrichment activities so that they can apply those in a variety of settings. So I think that educators are really struggling with this, but also thinking about what we can do to support continued growth and development, both during online learning and as we return to in-person schooling.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone who's been submitting questions. We're going to get through as many of them as we can. Brian, I would like to come back to you, because Leslie was just talking about development and then, interactions that happen and enrichment. And you've talked about how there are benefits that children and adults get from kind of the informal interactions that happen in the course of a school day that are not going to happen if you're operating remotely. How much of a toll can the absence of those kind of interactions have on students and teachers? And are there any kind of coping strategies that you can suggest or things that people can do in the online space to mimic that?
Sure, thank you. I do think that the social emotional needs of students and teachers and parents, but of students is really, really important to bear in mind. And so part of what happens often in the remote learning environment is it really kind of strips out everything but the academics, or it has a tendency to do that. And we forget all of these informal interactions that students have, hanging out in the hall or chatting before school starts, or eating lunch together in the cafeteria, or playing on the playground, or whatever it may be. And to Leslie's point about learning happening all the time, students are learning in those environments. They're making friendships. They're learning how to interact with each other. They're developing their interpersonal skills. And we have seen, certainly among our population, and from conversations I've had with some of the psychological counselors we work with, an uptick in social emotional distress among students during this time. We also are seeing lots of information from our parents about that lost opportunity for social interaction. And so I do think that there are things that we can do to help mitigate that. One, again, is just being aware of the problem. And so I think Leslie referenced earlier some things around wellness checks, phone calls, text messages. I think during live lessons, there are opportunities to really connect with each other and emphasize that, take time for that, take time to check in on students. I think building opportunities for students to interact with one another to the extent that that's age appropriate and doesn't further complicate the technology, I think can be really valuable. And making sure that you have mechanisms in place to address issues that do arise. We have found that students sometimes in the online space maybe are more open to disclosing things about themselves and their experiences because of almost this perceived anonymity or distance through the computer. And again, this depends on the age of the student, but making sure that there are opportunities, and of course school systems have these escalation models and support structures in place, but making sure they get mapped onto the remote learning experience, I think is really, really important.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to some more reporter questions here now. And here's one, and Ken, I'll come to you first, and this is related to the question that I asked you a few moments ago. But Greg Childress at NC Policy Watch asked, what are the consequences for the US if we don't get remote learning right during the pandemic? And of course, we've already touched on that, but I wonder if that particular question, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, good question. Well, I think that some of these problems are also facing children worldwide, so the US is not alone in it. On the other hand, we may not be dealing and coping and responding to the problem as well as some other nations. So the consequences for the long term are to fall behind comparatively in educational progress, and to fall behind on an absolute basis, that we're not giving our children the education that they need to be successful down the line. Children grow they develop. We cannot simply have them stand still for 6 months or a year and expect that we can presume that they'll pick up at that point later on and make up later on. That simply is not the way that it happens. A year in the life of a 9-year-old child is a huge proportion of that child's life, and that child will permanently lag behind unless we attend to these problems.
Absolutely, thank you. And the 11-year-old sitting on a couch behind me is uppermost in my thoughts as I listen to that answer. We're going to move on. Another question from Cole Del Charco from WUNC, and this is for you, Leslie. What kind of concerns did teachers of English language learners express for continued remote learning?
Yeah, good question. So as a reminder, we're working with classroom teachers who had within their classroom students who were English language learners. And so some of our teachers were telling us about their concerns overall for students, as well as for the specific English learners who were in our study. But certainly access was one of the key things, like making sure that at the very basic level that students were able to log on to the learning platforms that were offered. I can tell you this past spring, let's see, about half of the students who were English learners in our study participated less than 50% of the lessons that were available provided by the teacher. So certainly that's a concern. Teachers were also providing a lot of supports to children and their families. So a lot of texting in the evening, phone calls with parents, trying to help them support their young students. So in the future, schools really need to look at all those supplemental supports available to families. So certainly translation support, but also tech support and other kinds of social and emotional support. And to Brian's point about the significant trauma that we've all experienced as a result of this pandemic, I think we really do need to pay attention to the social and emotional development of students. Some of the teachers in our study actually did a really nice job trying to recreate some of the social and emotional opportunities that are available during an in-person school day. So they were doing things like holding a morning class for Google Meets, where they were having that opportunity, even for very young children, to check in with one another, to talk about their day, to have the normal kind of social routine that they would have had were they in person. And so I think it's going to take a change in mindset about some of those informal social and emotional opportunities that are available in in-person schooling, and be really intentional about how we support students in an online environment. It's certainly not going to be the same, and I don't think anyone would recommend it as our first choice, but it's where we are. And I think that teachers and schools are doing a good job in thinking through what needs to happen to support their students and their families.
Gotcha. Thank you very much for that. We'll move swiftly on here. I've got another question. And Brian, I'll pose this one to you first, but certainly interested in all panelists weighing in if you have thoughts. So this is from a reporter who has spoken with some teachers in the Cape Fear region and said it doesn't sound like there's a specific policy or intervention that really supports low-income families in the age of digital learning. For example, how can a student who takes care of their siblings find time to do their schoolwork? How can they find the motivation if no one is supporting them at home because the parent or parents are working and out of home during the day to complete the work? Do you have any what kind of concrete suggestions or help can we give to students who are in that kind of position?
Oh, wow, that's a great question, Greg. And I'm not sure that I have easy answers. I know that some school districts, Wake County in particular, I believe, is looking at childcare options to help support families during this time in circumstances like that. But we certainly know that there are lots of low-income students who do have additional financial responsibilities. And we know that remote learning, even independent of those things, requires really a different type of motivation because you're missing that structure of the regular school day and you're at home with all of these other distractions. But I do think, exploring more comprehensive solutions around childcare, around supervision, And I would certainly love to hear, I'm sure Ken and Leslie both have some thoughts on this as well, but I think it really gets to a fundamental question or problem around education, in that to some extent, it has become, maybe understandably so, a child care vehicle, and that's important. But what happens when the child care aspect conflicts with the education aspect? And so I think community supports, looking at child care options, are really absolutely necessary.
Let me jump in, Greg. And thank you, Brian. Your points remind me of all of the wonderful things that our public education system does for our families in the United States. And we criticize the public school system too much, but they do an awful lot, not only, of course, first and foremost in providing education for our children, but 20 million children receive subsidized school breakfasts and or lunches each day. That's nutrition, that's basic support that is not being served well if children are at home. We have 26 million K-12, 26 million students, children who are under age 12 attending public schools. And best guidelines are that those children really should not be alone in their homes for a long period of time unsupervised. So we've got a supervision problem that the public schools have provided support for over the years. It's a problem that certainly disproportionately affects low-income families who cannot provide that extra support, but not only low-income families. 10 million children in America, public school age children in America, have a parent who is either a healthcare worker, or have all parents who are either healthcare workers or first responders, police, fire, etc. And they're working, they're not in our home. There's a false assumption that everybody, all adults are at home with nothing to do and they can supervise their children during education. 10 million children have all of their parents either being a healthcare worker or frontline worker. They need supervision. This is a huge challenge. Our public schools have served us well in that capacity. We now have to figure out other kinds of solutions.
Yes, if I could jump in here. I agree with Ken about all of these concerns in figuring out how to help students benefit from online instruction. We learned in our study with teachers that 55% of students had some help in the home from another adult or a sibling. And I think I want to go back to your point about siblings supporting one another in accessing online learning. As you can imagine, in families of English learners, the older siblings really do take on a lot of responsibility in terms of translating their parents as they acquire English. They're serving in adult roles earlier than children from English-speaking families. And we heard from our teachers that some of the kindergarten and first grade students were getting support from their siblings who were as young as second graders. And so second graders in the home who had been in school for a couple of years and acquired English were supporting their younger kindergarten and first grade siblings in accessing online education. I think we absolutely have to attend to the potential burden, not only for our English learner families, but all of our families that older siblings are taking on during this time. They're being asked to provide a lot of childcare kinds of support, but also academic support at the risk of losing time for focusing on their own education. It's a tremendous problem that I think we really do need to highlight and address.
Absolutely, thank you. And another quick logistical note, Leslie, somebody, Cordell Charco, asked if you could repeat the % of students that didn't participate in your previous answer, because your internet was cutting out. Do you have that number?
Yeah, sorry about my internet. And we are right. A research brief on these teacher surveys that I hope to have ready in the next couple of days, so I can share that with you. But again, you wanted to know the % of students who didn't participate?
Yeah.
So of the students we were tracking in our study, so these are the English learners in 17 elementary schools, teachers told us that 48% of them did not have a parent who were able to support them. And then in terms of how much education they missed, let me look that up. I forget which statistic I was giving you for that, but
not to worry. We got the percent that that was asked for, so that's perfectly fine.
Okay, and then like I said, I'll follow up with a brief with the specific statistics for anyone who's interested.
Absolutely, thank you. Okay, we'll move on to another.
Jump in and
yes,
note
please
the
do.
irony of the internet access problem that we have right here, and imagine what our children, our school children, are going to face.
Absolutely, it's a very good point. As adults, we struggle with it. We can't expect it to be plain sailing for children. We've got another question here, and as a matter of fact, Ken, since you just spoke, we'll start with you here. And this is saying that there's an argument to reopen schools, and people making that argument have repeatedly said doing classes online will do potentially irreparable harm to children's development, access to resources for low-income children, etc. Is there any research that shows whether learning online does harm development, or is in any kind of irreparably inferior to in-person learning? Is there anything that kind of gives us any sense of that?
Yeah, I'm not aware of direct randomized control trials of in-person learning versus remote learning, but I do point to the research I referred to before about the learning loss that occurs over the summertime. Particularly for low-income children. During the summertime, children still have access to whatever other educational opportunities, but it's not in school. So I do think that not being in person in the school building is likely to bring a loss. Remote education compensates. I think we're fooling ourselves if we think it will compensate 100%. It won't, but it may be necessary. It may be the best thing we can do. I should also point out that some schools are moving to a 3-2 system or an every other week system. Particularly private schools are trying to do this, and they're considering themselves as having in-person education, and that's great. But even those schools mean that half of the time the children are at home and are expected to be participating in remote education.
Gotcha, thank you. And I'll give our other panelists a second in case you'd like to jump in on that. If not,
sure,
I can.
Greg,
Yes.
I would just add, and this is not research, but more in the program evaluation vein, that we have been gathering some data over the last couple of years for our online programs. And again, it's a subset of the population, academically gifted and talented students in a variety of grades. But we have seen over the last couple of years that completion rates in our online programs that are designed for enrichment, not regular school environments, so take that into account, but completion rates for students of lower income backgrounds, as well as students from underrepresented populations, do lag their upper income and majority population peers. So again, it's not research. We haven't compared it across these things, but from a program evaluation standpoint, we do have at least some evidence that we're, as part of our diversity and inclusion efforts, beginning to look at and try to unpack, what's going on with that, what type of additional supports can we offer in that respect to help those students be as successful as their peers.
Thank you both very much for that. Moving on, we've had another question regarding the divide between public and private education. Now, certainly before the pandemic hit, in North Carolina and beyond, there were debates over public funding going towards private schools and how efficient that was as a means of providing education. And now we have a situation in which millions of children are having to learn remotely. Are there any concerns that ongoing private and public debate feeds into this, in the sense that it's possible that if funding is going to private schools, perhaps that will take away what ability public schools do have to provide remote learning? Is there any, do those debates map onto each other at all? Or do you have any particular concerns as it pertains to public-private differences in education?
I have some concerns about the assumption that private education can take over what public education has done. That might well be the case for children who can't afford it or for which there is adequate funding. But all too often, low-income children, even if they get scholarships to attend private schools, are not able to have the financial and social resources at home to do what their higher income peers in those private schools can do. Internet access being one, computer access, these kinds of materials, parental supervision. So I don't think it's a simple solution that private education is the answer here. Private education performs a very important function in our society, but it doesn't replace for everybody. By and large, 90% of our children are in public schools, and we need a public response.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. We're going to move on here so we can fit in another question at least before we sign off. And the question here is that everyone acknowledges, and we've mentioned it here, I think all of you have, that teaching remotely requires a different skill set for teachers than teaching in a classroom. Just as learning online requires a different skill set as well. And most teachers and students haven't had to develop these skills up until now. What can be done in the short term and immediately to improve that process so everybody has a better experience?
I could talk a little bit about how the teachers in our study are responding to that. So from what we've seen, schools are starting to provide support for certain learning platforms that they're asking all of their teachers to use. And one of the things that we've seen that really works is collaboration among school professionals. And so this is really an opportunity to leverage one another's strengths to serve all of our students in an online environment. So each teacher doesn't have to create his or her own suite of lessons, but rather teachers could specialize in different learning platform lessons for students. It's really important for students who are served by more than one teacher, say in an elementary setting, like a classroom, an ESL teacher or special education teacher, that those teachers have both the time and the framework to collaborate with one another so that they could really leverage one another's strengths. And so schools really need to provide time for teachers to both learn how to use the learning platforms, but also to develop new lesson content to make it available to their students. This is a whole new ballgame.
And Greg, I would piggyback on what Leslie was saying and circle back to even my first response in that I think it's really important to be very intentional about building lessons, devoting instructional time so that the students can learn the platform. That's not lost time, but creating modules of instruction where the goal is solely for the student to understand and be able to use effectively and practice those tools that they'll be using for the next weeks or months. Hopefully not, much longer than that. And we found that has been very, very successful in our programs, having dedicated time. Whether you call it an orientation, whether you call it a getting started module, whether you call it a just unit one, you can incorporate aspects of digital citizenship, which I think is incredibly important for these students to make sure that they are understanding things about online privacy and security, how to represent themselves in the online space, what to share and what not to share, as well as the technological aspects. And if there is a silver lining in this, one of the benefits for students of going through this process is that they are developing, if it's done well and they have the opportunity to practice, they are developing some pretty critical 21st century skills that will equip them for study in universities or a variety of workplace contexts where they may very well, just like we are here, have to interact productively with people using technology.
Thank you very much. And Ken, I'd like to come to you actually to close with the context that question actually came from a state representative. So I'd like to give you the opportunity to re-emphasize, what the state and federal governments can be doing to address inequity and make online learning an accessible experience for everybody.
Yes, state governments provide a lot of support for our public education. Right now, they could allocate emergency funds to provide internet access, to provide training for parents and students, to provide extra support for teachers who are no doubt going to be putting in extra overtime in order to make this successful. They are linchpins, state legislatures, that is, are linchpins in providing the financial resources and providing the moral leadership and the character leadership that we need. So I'm delighted a state representative might be interested, and I would be delighted to follow up offline.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I think we will leave it there. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thanks to our panelists, Leslie Babinski, Brian Cooper, and Kenneth Dodge for sharing your perspectives. In next week's briefing, we'll be discussing how to address the misinformation and disinformation that's warping how Americans respond to the pandemic, racial justice, and other issues. If you'd like to be included on that advisory, please email dukenews@duke.edu. In the meantime, thank you for joining us, and please stay well. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.